Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share Spellbinders March 2025 Clubs Part 3. I've already done 2 videos with it, one devoted to this Better Press plate of the month. I absolutely love that background Better Press plate. I also love that the Stencil of the month this month coordinates with both the embossing folder of the month as well as the Better Press of the month, which makes it even more valuable in my opinion because there's so many different ways that you can use it. This video is going to be centered around the large die of the month, creating 4 different cards, 3 of them with the large die of the month, 2 of them incorporate the 3D embossing folder of the month. My first video was more masculine and I created a golf and a fishing card focused around this die of the month as well as the bonus caboodle item, which are sentiments that coordinate perfectly with that die of the month. My second one, like I said, focused on that Better Press of the month. This one here focuses on the large die of the month, but I'm also going to incorporate the embossing folder and a few of the club items just to tie them in and find out more ways to use them. So I encourage you to check out part 1 and part 2 because I'm using the club items in many different ways. I'm going to start today by using that wax seal of the month, and I want to create some flower centers. For my third card, I'm going to be using some of the florals from the large die of the month. And I thought rather than using the die cut that comes with it, it might be interesting to use the silver beads in the basic wax mix that come with the wax seal of the month and use them to create some really fun and textured flowers. And the silver beads in this basic wax mix, they kind of look a little bit like pewtery, vintagey. They have dark tones to them. So when you create these little pieces, it looks like they're already distressed and already antiqued. I'm creating just tiny dots of the wax and I'm using my toothpick here. I usually use this toothpick to just swirl in the wax to make sure everything is melted, but I'm using it to kind of cut off my wax stream from the little melter pourer thing here so that I get smaller bits. I don't want to have a complete wax seal. I'm just trying to get that texture from the center. I created a bunch of them. I have them off screen. I won't be using every single one of them, but I always like to create extras so that I have more than I need and I can pick and choose which ones I want to use. I also used that wax seal of the month in my part 1 video, and I used it to create a golf ball for the golf themed card. So if you want another way to use it, I encourage you to check out that video. For my first card, I'm using the embossing folder of the month, just embossing some Hammermill Cardstock. Now, when I have an embossing folder like this that is a little bit symmetrical, I do try to center it in the center of my embossing folder. I center it up and down and left and right. And then I used a full piece of 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch Hammermill cardstock, and then I trim it down afterwards. Sometimes when you emboss, especially with 3D embossing folders, it distorts the size of the cardstock. So by having it a little bit larger and then trimming it down afterwards, you can ensure that you're going to get the exact size that you're looking for. I grabbed my sticky mat to hold that embossed piece of cardstock, and then I'm using the coordinating stencil of the month to ink up part of that embossed image. There's 2 stencils that coordinate with this embossed background. I'm only going to use one of them because I thought it would be a little bit more interesting to have part of that embossed inked and part of it not. You absolutely could use both if you wanted all of the embossed areas inked. Another option would be to just use that stencil of the month on its own and just have that stenciled image. So there's many different ways that you can use them on their own. This stencil of the month will also be great with some different pastes or different sprays as well. By using my sticky mat, it holds down that stencil to make sure that it stays in the right area as long as you line it up perfectly. First, you saw that I lifted it up and moved it after doing a little bit of inking because I realized that it wasn't quite lined up properly. For that inking, I just used some Stormy Sky Distress ink. My pieces for this card were die cut from some partly cloudy cardstock as well as Raindrop Cardstock, so I chose the Distress ink to coordinate with that. And I'm doing a little bit of light ink blending on some of the die cuts to coordinate all of those ink and cardstock colors. I used a large Spellbinders ink blending brush for that. I love the fact that when you use them, you get some really light ink blending. You can always add extra layers if you want it a little bit darker, but you have a little bit more control. It's great for larger areas. It's definitely not a great tool for small pieces that you want to do ink blending on, but for larger areas and backgrounds, it's fantastic. The little dinosaur from the large die of the month. And the large die of the month has this vignette that I already put together towards my right hand side there. There also has pieces for a dinosaur. There's also pieces for a dog, as well as some florals. So there's a great variety in there to use for many different themes. The stamp of the month is a bunch of different sentiments as well. And there's a coordinating die set as well to cut them out. And the glimmer of the month is also some sentiments. So those sentiments I created in my part 2 video. So if you want to see them created, that's where you'll find them. I will be using them on the card today. I'm not creating more sentiments because when you use both that clear stamp of the month as well as the glimmer of the month, you create a ton of sentiments. So that little craft stacks that I just showed there is all the leftover sentiments after creating some cards for my part 2 video. So I have a ton of them left over. So I'm using some of those leftover ones. It was fantastic to be able to have all of those sentiments. Some of the pieces for this dinosaur, the little skirt as well as the crown, were done with some holographic silver cardstock. But what you can also do, I did my foiling for part 2 with the prism glimmer foil. You could also use the solid hot foil pieces to die cut those pieces out. When I die cut these pieces, I didn't have those pieces done yet, and I didn't have any scraps of solid hot foiled prism cardstock in my scrap bin to use. So I just did some silver holographic, but like I said, both of them work perfectly, and it's just a great way to use up some of that solid hot foiled cardstock if you don't necessarily, or if you don't have the silver holographic. So with my little dinosaur as well as the crowns all assembled, and you can see how easy it was to assemble them, I'm adding a little bit of diamond gems to that crown just to give it a little bit of extra texture. It ties in with the blues. When I'm using these gems, I like to use a die pick to kind of pierce into the adhesive on the back. I used a larger one in the center and a smaller one to either side, and they stick to that holographic cardstock perfectly. For my next card, I'm going to use the puppy dog from this die set. Now, I went right off the bat and I put glue on a cardstock piece that I hadn't meant to. I had cut the background part of the dog's head with this black cardstock, and for some reason I put glue on that instead of putting glue on the piece that was going to go on top of it. So you saw me wipe it right off there. For this background here, I use for the puppy dog here, I use latte cardstock as well as portobello cardstock, and then the black cardstock for that background. There's also a tongue to hang out of the dog's mouth, so I put some glue on that. I definitely did assemble this out of order, or parts of it out of order. So you'll see that I go back in and tuck different things in, such as that tongue, and you'll see me in a moment tucking in the bone in the mouth. When I first assembled the face of the dog, I wasn't sure if I was going to put anything in this mouth. And then after I had it assembled, I decided I wanted him to be carrying that bone in his mouth. So the nice thing about using liquid glue is it gives you that little bit of wiggle room. So nothing had to be ripped apart. The glue hadn't set quite yet, so it was really easy to lift up the cardstock pieces and tuck in the different areas. Now, this set also has a little pair of slippers that you can put in the dog's mouth. I'm going to put it so that the dog is kind of sitting on them. And then there's also a little baseball hat, which is also a fun thing to use with that dog as well. For my background for this card, I'm going to use the Better Press of the month and use it in my Better Press system. Now, originally when I was putting it in the system here, I was just going to press the pattern in there and just have some pattern in the background. I end up opting to ink that Better Press background with some old paper distress ink to tie in with the browns that are on the dog. But I also wanted it to be really, really light in color. I didn't want to have that pattern taking anything away from the focal point, which is going to be the dog. So I chose a really, really light color. I inked that plate up, put the clear top to the base, and then ran it through my Platinum 6 machine to press that pattern in. And you can see that we get a nice pattern, but it's not overwhelming. It's very light. We're going to have that texture in the background, but we're going to really see that focal point, which is the dog. Another option would be to just not use any ink at all, and then just press that pattern in there. For the first 3 cards in this video, my outer mats are trimmed to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. My embossed pieces or my patterned background pieces are trimmed to 3¾ inches by 5 inches. So I want to see that frame of that mat around there, and it's going to tie in with the little vignette piece that I have on the front for the first card with the dinosaur, for the second card with the puppy dog. The third card, I don't use that vignette. You easily could adapt the card to include that, but I wanted to share using that large die of the month without using that vignette. I also think that vignette would be great for creating a shaker element for the fronts of cards. So that's another option as well. I don't do it. I do shaker cards fairly often, and I wanted to share a way to use it without that, but that's another way that you can use it. To add that old paper distress ink, I just inked up a little bit towards the bottom of the inner part of my vignette, and that one was die cut from some fog cardstock. So the great thing about a lot of the pieces from the large die of the month is a lot of the pieces are fairly small, so they're perfect for using up a bunch of cardstock scraps. The other thing that I love about these clubs, like I said before, is how many sentiments you can create when using both the clear stamp of the month as well as the glimmer of the month. And they're not necessarily all exactly the same sentiments for both of them, so you get a variety between the different sets here. And by using this liquid glue, I can make sure that I have that wiggle room. I can put that dog down, and then I can also lift him up just to tuck in those slippers there where it makes sense. And I have those slippers die cut out of some partly cloudy cardstock, which is the same color that I used for that outer part of the vignette as well as my outer mat. So they coordinate perfectly. And for this one, I put the sentiment in that vignette. You could always leave it off that vignette and put it towards the bottom of the card and have it on the background instead if you wanted to have a little bit more space. Now, anytime we have a little character that has eyes and nose, I always love putting glossy accents on there to add that shine to it. For this one, I also add a little bit of glossy accents to his tongue as well as on little areas of the bone. I thought it possibly looked a little bit like dog slobber. That might be gross for some people, but I thought it might be a fun addition. So I put that on there. You do want to let it dry completely. If you get any bubbles in that glossy accents, you want to take a pin and pop those bubbles before it dries. If it dries with the bubbles, there's no way to ever get them out. For the third card, I'm using the florals from the large die of the month. I have them die cut out of some poppy field cardstock. I kind of thought these florals looked a little bit like poppies. I also have the outer parts of the large florals die cut out of some crimson cardstock. And those little pieces are definitely easier to assemble and add to the flower die cut by using some reverse tweezers. Sometimes they're a little bit hard to grab with the reverse tweezers, and I sometimes have to use my fingers to put them in the reverse tweezers, but placing them on that flower is a lot easier when you have them in those reverse tweezers, as well as the fact that you don't have your fingers in the way of the glue, so you're not going to get glue all over your fingers. So once I have all of those pieces together, I can glue down those wax seal centers, and I really love the final look of, or the look of it, how they looked on the card or on the flowers. Now, again, you don't have to do the wax seals in the center of the flowers. You can just die cut the pieces, but they do create a really cool and unique look, and that adds some texture to the center of those florals as well. So I just use my Barely Art glue to glue them in place. I've never had a problem using that liquid glue to glue those wax seals in place. And then I let them dry completely. There's also some smaller flowers that have kind of a side profile, so I glued them together. I die cut those out of the Raindrop Cardstock. I wanted this card to kind of coordinate with the first two cards, but not necessarily be all blues. So that's where I incorporated the blues, was with the smaller florals. And once again, these florals are nice and tiny, so they're great for using cardstock scraps. And obviously, with florals, you can die cut them out of whatever colors you want, whether realistic colors or whether fantasy colors. Now, I chose not to do any ink blending on these flowers. You certainly could if you wanted to. It definitely would add some visual dimension. Sometimes I do it and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I like the cleaner look without the ink blending. And sometimes I like having that ink blending on there and having that little bit of visual dimension. It does definitely add something to it, but I'm not necessarily always in the mood for that. The 3D embossing folder of the month has some like kind of a chain link background as well as florals all over the left side and the bottom part. So I'm going to use this for this card. I'm also going to use it in the next card, but I'm going to position my cardstock differently on that 3D embossing folder each time. Look at those gorgeous florals. You could use this piece just as it is, and I think it would be stunning and create a very simple card. I also think it would be really, really pretty with that Lisa Horton gold wax that on white cardstock just has an iridescent glow to it. I think it would be gorgeous on that as well. I took that Stormy Sky ink or distress pad. I had some ink still on my brush, so I just lightly brushed it. This just on its own I think would look stunning as well, just these blue florals. But I wanted to add a little bit of metallic to it, so I used the new Lisa Horton Metallic Titanium ink pad. I'm just using my fingers to lightly put it over the raised surface. I'm trying to be as light as possible because, first of all, I don't want to get a whole lot of ink on that background. I want it to be as clean as possible. You can see that I do get a little bit on the background, but with the final look that I'm going for, a tiny little bit is not a big deal. I'm just trying to have a little bit of control over it. I also put that color on the leaves. I don't necessarily want the leaves to be exactly the same color as the flower. And I also put it on the flower centers, just to add that little bit of metallic and a little bit of color variation from the Stormy Sky Distress that I have on those florals. Once I have that done, I can trim this piece down, and just like the first card where I used a full 4¼ by 5½ inch piece, I did that for this piece as well. I am trimming that down to 3¾ inches by 5 inches. I started with trimming down by the floral areas, and then I trimmed the top and the right side to make it that 3¾ inches by 5 inches. I wanted to make sure not to die cut or not to trim down too much of the florals. I wanted to have as much of that as possible on the card. To coordinate with my poppy field flowers that I've created for this card, I have a mat that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. I'm going to glue that on my card base and then glue my embossed piece on there. Now, anytime I use embossing, I like to make sure, or embossed cardstock, I like to make sure to be fairly liberal with the glue. Make sure that I have a good amount of glue on those recessed areas that are going to touch my layer underneath to make sure that it glues down properly. Then I can add my different floral die cuts. Now I'm adding die cuts on top of my embossed background. I love the look of the embossed florals combined with the die cut florals. You don't necessarily have to if you don't want to. You could just have that embossed card and then add a sentiment to it, and I think that would look fantastic. Another option would be to use a different embossing folder for your background, but I do really love these two combined together. I think they blend perfectly. They're not exactly the same floral, so they're not identical to each other, but I do think they complement each other. You can see that I put my red focal flower on first, and then I'm tucking other pieces behind it. Sometimes I will place my focal piece down but not glue it in place, and then start with the outside and work my way in. It just really depends on the final look as well as the die cuts that I'm using. This particular one I didn't do it because this one was glued down to a stem that had some leaves, so I wanted to have those leaves on there, so then when I placed the other pieces towards the bottom especially, I had those underneath there so that I could glue those pieces on top. So once my florals are all down, I'm going to take one of the sentiments that was made in my part 2 video, and I'm going to glue that on there. Now I chose to glue it partly onto one of my florals and partly off, so it's not completely level with the base of the card. If you wanted it to be completely level, you could take some foam strips and put that towards the right side of that sentiment to make sure that it was nice and level. For what I was going for, I didn't mind if it was a little bit higher on the left side and then lower on the right side. Again, depends the look that you're going for and depends what works for you. For my last card here, I have another piece of Hammermill Cardstock. This one, once again, is 4¼ by 5½ inches, but I changed where I put it on my embossing folder. I put it on the bottom and I put it horizontal to the bottom of it so that I get a lot more of the florals that are on that bottom there. For this one, I used some Candied Apple Distress ink to lightly ink blend the florals. And originally when I started, I had only planned on doing the Candied Apple. And then I realized that I had red leaves, and I didn't really like the fact that the leaves were pretty much the same color as the florals. So I ended up going back and grabbing that titanium pad and adding a little bit of that as well. I also put some Black Soot Distress ink in the center of those florals. To me, both of these, both the die cuts as well as this emboss here, it looks a little bit like poppies. So that's kind of the look that I was going for here, a kind of poppy Remembrance Day type feel. So I put some black in the center of those florals. If you didn't want it to be quite so stark, hickory smoke would also work. It would give the same feel, but it wouldn't be quite as dark as the black. And then once again, grabbed that titanium metallic ink pad and used my fingers to add some light color to those leaves just to make them look different from the florals. And you can see that I didn't go heavy with that titanium. I went fairly light. Again, just creating that look there. I don't want it to be overwhelming. Then I also took that titanium and put a little bit on top of the black in the center of those florals. So with that done, I can trim the floral embossed piece here, and I'm trimming it once again to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I will do another mat to go outside the perimeter of my card, and that will be trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. That is going to be the poppy field layer that I'm using. That black layer that I just trimmed was cut to 3 7/8 by 5 1/8. So I'm going to have a double mat around this. I wanted to have both that poppy color as well as the black. I wanted to tie into both colors that we had on the card, and that was the best way to do it. I didn't want to cut down my embossed piece too much, but I did want to have that double frame and really highlight both of those colors there. So I glued both of those down, and then we're ready to glue down that embossed piece. And once again, anytime I do an embossed piece, I make sure that there's a good amount of glue on the recessed areas that are going to have contact with the piece below. I also like to often put an acrylic block on there just to hold that in place and make sure that it has good contact, stays nice and flat. For this card, I used one of the foiled sentiments, but because it's foiled with prism foil on white cardstock and I have a white background here, I didn't think it was going to show up really well. So I took my scrap of onyx cardstock here and I glued that sentiment down to it and just did a really thin mat around it just to make it pop off the card. And this one, I can't remember the exact phrase of it, but it says something about being, or you're my hero, or something to that effect, which in my opinion, if this is a poppy card with kind of a Remembrance Day feel, I thought it worked really well with that. So I glued that in place. I grabbed the extra die cut that I had from doing my third card, thought about adding it, but it was too much. I wanted this to be nice and soft. I still wanted to add a tiny bit of extra texture to it, so I took some stickles, this is Stardust stickles, and just dotted it in the centers of the florals. It's just going to add the sparkle of that glitter to it. It's not adding any color or anything, and I dotted in there so it gives that texture. It also is not a large amount there. So here is the final result with those stickles in the center. They don't really catch the light as much on the video as they do in person, but it's a great way to use this embossing folder. You don't need much more than that embossing folder. It's such a gorgeous look to it and a gorgeous texture that it creates. Then we have our third card with not only that embossing folder, but also the floral dies from that large die of the month. And then we have our adorable puppy card. I think this one is so fun, and I love the different pieces that you can add to it. And the You Make Me So Proud is just perfect for a little puppy dog that's chewing on his bone and not on those slippers. Then we have our fun dinosaur card with that holographic shine to it. Again, I absolutely love the clubs for this month. I hope you enjoyed all 3 videos that I created using them. They were so much fun to create with and play with. Thank you so much for all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.